John Keats, a biographical account. John Keats was an English romantic poet. He was one of the most prominent figures of the second generation of romantic poets, along with Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley. Let's read the biography of this great poet. Early years. A revered English poet whose short life spanned just 25 years, John Keats was born on October 31st, 1795, in London, England. He was the eldest of Thomas and Frances Keats, 4 children. Keats lost his parents at an early age. He was 8 years old when his father, a livery stable keeper, was killed after being trampled by a horse. In a more mundane sense, Keats' father's death greatly disrupted the family's financial security. His mother, Frances, seemed to have launched a series of missteps and mistakes after her husband's death. She quickly remarried and just as quickly lost a good portion of the family's wealth. After her second marriage fell apart, Frances left the family, leaving her children in the care of her mother. She eventually returned to her children's life, but her life was in tatters. In early 1810, she died of tuberculosis. During this period, Keats found solace and comfort in art and literature. At Enfield Academy, where he started shortly before his father's passing away, Keats proved to be a voracious reader. He also became close to the school headmaster, John Clark, who served as a father figure for the orphan student and encouraged Keats to study literature. There is some debate as to whose decision it was to pull Keats out of Enfield, but in the fall of 1810, Keats left the school for studies to become a surgeon. He eventually studied medicine at a London hospital and became a licensed apothecary in 1816. Early poetry. But Keats' career in medicine never truly took off. Even as he studied medicine, Keats' devotion to literature and arts never ceased. Through his friend, Cowden Clarke, whose father was the headmaster at Enfield, Keats met publisher Leigh Hunt for the Examiner. Hunt's radicalism and biting pen had landed him in prison in 1813 for libeling Prince Regent. Hunt had an eye for talent and was an early supporter of Keats' poetry and became his first publisher. Through Hunt, Keats was introduced to a world of politics that was new to him and had greatly influenced what he put on the page. In honor of Hunt, Keats wrote the sonnet, written on the day that Mr. Leigh Hunt left prison. In addition to affirming Keats' standing as a poet, Hunt also introduced the young poet to a group of other English poets, including Percy Bysshe Shelley and William Wordsworth. In 1817, Keats leveraged his new friendships to publish his first volume of poetry, Poems by John Keats. The following year, Keats published Endymion, a mammoth 4,000-line poem based on the Greek myth of the same name. Keats had written the poem in the summer and fall of 1817, committing himself to at least 40 lines a day. He completed the work in November of that year, and it was published in April 1818. Keats' daring and bold style earned him nothing but criticism from 2 of England's more revered publications, Blackwood's Magazine and the Quarterly Review. The attacks were an extension of heavy criticism lobbed at Hunt and his gather of young poets. The most damning of those pieces had come from Blackwood, whose piece on the Cockney school of poetry shook Keats and made him nervous to publish Endymion. Recovering poet. How much of an effect this criticism had on Keats is uncertain, but it is clear that he did take notice of it. But Shelley's later accounts of how the criticism destroyed the young poet and led to his declining health, however, have been refuted. Keats, in fact, had already moved beyond Endymion even before it was published. By the end of 1817, he was re-examining the role of poetry in the society. In lengthy letters to friends, Keats outlined his vision of a kind of poetry that drew its beauty from real-world human experience rather than some mythical grandeur. Keats was also formulating the thinking behind his most famous doctrine, negative capability, which is the idea that humans are capable of transcending intellectual or social constraints and far exceed creatively or intellectually what human nature is thought to allow. In effect, Keats was responding to his critics and conventional thinking in general, which sought to squeeze the human experience into a closed system with tidy labels and rational relationships. Keats saw a world more chaotic, more creative than what others he felt would permit. The mature poet. In the summer of 1818, Keats took a walking tour in northern England and Scotland. He returned home later that year to care for his brother, Tom, who had fallen deeply ill with tuberculosis. Keats, who around this time fell in love with a woman named Fanny Brawne, continued to write. He had proven prolific for much of the past year. His work included his first Shakespearean sonnet, When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be, which was published in January 1818. 2 months later, Keats published Isabella, a poem that tells the story of a woman who falls in love with a man beneath her social standing, instead of the man her family had chosen her to marry. The work was based on a story from Italian poet Giovanni Boccaccio, and it's one Keats himself would grow to dislike. His work also included the beautiful To Autumn, a sensuous work published in 1820 that describes ripening fruit, sleepy workers, and a maturing sun. The poem and others demonstrated a style Keats himself had crafted all his own, one that was filled with more sensualities than any contemporary romantic poetry. Keats' writing also revolved around a poem he called Hipparine, an ambitious romantic piece inspired by Greek myth that told the story of the Titans' despondency after they lost to the Olympians. But the death of Keats' brother halted his writing. He finally returned to the work in late 1819, rewriting his unfinished poem with a new title, The Fall of Hipparine, which went unpublished until more than 3 decades after Keats' death. This, of course, speaks to the small audience for Keats' poetry during his lifetime. In all, the poet published 3 volumes of poetry during his life, but managed to sell just a combined 200 copies of his work by the time of his death in 1821. His third and final volume of poetry, Lamia, Isabella, The Eve of St. Agnes, and Other Poems, was published in July 1820. Only with the help of his friends, who pushed hard to secure Keats' legacy and the work and style of Alfred, Lord Tennyson, the poet laureate of the United Kingdom during the latter half of the 19th century, did Keats' stock rise considerably. Final years. In 1819, Keats contracted tuberculosis. His health deteriorated quickly. Soon after his last volume of poetry was published, he ventured off to Italy with his close friend, the painter Joseph Severn, on the advice of his doctor, who had told him he needed to be in a warmer climate for the winter. The trip marked the end of his romance with Fanny Brawne. His health issues and his own dreams of becoming a successful writer had stifled their chance of ever getting married. Keats arrived in Rome in November of that year and for a brief time started to feel better. But within a month, he was back in bed, suffering from a high temperature. The last few months of life proved particularly painful for the poet. His doctor in Rome placed Keats on a strict diet that consisted of a single anchovy and a piece of bread per day in order to limit the flow of blood to the stomach. He also induced heavy bleeding, resulting in Keats suffering from both a lack of oxygen and a lack of food. Keats' agony was so severe that at one point he pressed his doctor and asked him, "How long is this posthumous existence of mine to go on?" Keats' death came on February 23, 1821. It is believed that he was clutching the hand of his friend, Joseph Severn, at the time of his passing. Keats was one of the most loved and loving of men, and the affection, philosophy, and humor he poured into his letters to his brothers, his sisters, his friends, and his fiancée show him to be as great a genius in prose as in poetry. For his friends he was an inspired creature. A sight of a flower, the glitter of the sun, the buzzing of a bee, seemed to make his nature tremble, yet until his last illness he was industrious and manly, taking long walks, playing cricket, boxing, and enjoying practical jokes. His friends and others have blamed the critics, Fanny Brawne and even George, for his untimely death. In fact, he was a victim to the family disease, which later carried off George as well, and that his own passionate nature drove him too hard for happiness. A biography of John Keats.